Now, if Dickens were opening his story, as in the story of A Tale of Two Cities, he'd start with, you know the words, it was the best of times and the worst of times. But today I'm reversing it. It was the worst of times and the best of times, because that's how the story unfolds. It's a story of two moms, one older, one younger, one named Naomi, and the other known as Ruth, the heroine of the story. It's one of the shortest books in the Bible, only 4 chapters, only 100 verses, and you can read it very quickly, and depending on the size of print that you have, it may only take up about 2 pages. But we're going to focus on just chapter 1 today. Well, indeed, it was the worst of times, as described in the book of Judges that precedes it, chapter 21, verse 25, saying that in those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. In other words, there was a lawlessness, a violence in this period, and even God's people became a law unto themselves. And right in the midst of this chaotic, dark age, we're given the story of this man, his wife, and their 2 boys, a short story in which we get a glimpse, a slice of life in what it was like to live through those tumultuous days. And if these were the worst of times, it ends out to be the best of times, because also it's a love story. One of the most beautiful love stories in Scripture, beautiful in its reading, yet difficult for us with modern minds to understand because of such customs and cultural things such as kinsmen, redeemers, and Levirate marriages, and the customary way in which, ladies, a woman could propose to a man by simply laying down at her feet. Some read things into that are not there, but it's a beautiful and wholesome story. Well, if it's the story of the worst of times, then soon into our story, the situation gets hotter still. Because in the wake of a devastating famine, her husband, that is Naomi's husband, makes the fateful decision that will affect not only him and his wife and their 2 sons, but their 2 future daughters-in-law as well. The husband, Elimelech, takes a wrong turn and steps out of the will of God. There are, in fact, 3 mistakes in the first few verses of the book of Ruth. First of all, the husband decides to leave the land of Israel and dwell in their most pagan enemy's nation, the Moabites, in hope of finding a better life. It was neither a good decision nor a wise one. And as innocuous as it might seem to us today, at that time it was a practice strictly forbidden to go and live in the land of Moab and to leave the children of God. For in Numbers chapter 25, we're told that the Moabites led the children of Israel away from God through sexual immorality and pagan worship, and that they were to have nothing to do with them. And lest you and I are tempted to judge them, I wonder how many times you and I have inadvertently or willingly stepped out of the will of God, especially in times that are tough, and when we're tempted to ask, how can I work my way out of this situation without God's help? And how many times have we done the same? We face difficult choices and we're tempted to step outside of God's circle and God's promises, seeking solutions to our problems on our own terms. Well, the Bible says in chapter 14, verse 12 of the book of Proverbs, there's a way that seems right to a man, but the way therein is the way of death. And so both left Bethlehem and the borders of Israel outside the boundaries of God's provision for his people, and they went looking for life in all the wrong places. Now, if the father in the story makes a mistake, also do his two sons. That's why I say there are three mistakes in the story. Because we read that Mahlon and Chilion take to themselves pagan, unbelieving wives from the Moabite people. Again, something strictly forbidden in the Old Testament and the New. For we read the words of St. Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14. Speaking in the context of marriage, he says, "Be ye not unequally yoked. For what fellowship should we have with darkness?" Well, what follows is a litany of disaster. First, Naomi's husband dies, and then both of her children dies, leaving both her and her two pagan daughters widowed. And the point of this tragedy is not that they're suddenly widowed, but that in those days, without property, without the prospect of marriage, they were virtually sentenced to death by starvation. It's then that Naomi makes up her mind to do what she must do, the only thing she can do, namely to return to her homeland, the people of her God, and trust in his goodness and mercy. So she packs up her meager belongings, and accompanied by her two daughters-in-law, they head north by northwest along the coast of the Dead Sea, headed for Jordan River and home to Bethlehem. Having begun on this trek, it's then that Naomi comes to the realization that if she takes her two daughters-in-law with her, they would be exposed to the same fate that she's hoping to escape from. For what man in Israel would ever marry a foreign girl, and an unbelieving one at that? And after her death, these two young ladies also would be alone and in danger of starvation. So she turns to them in verse 8, saying, "Go back, each of you, to your own family and your own mother. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt kindly with me." And then they raise up their voices and weep. And they cry together, this lovely adopted family. One of them, Orpah, not to be confused with Oprah, same letters, different order. Orpah chooses to go home while Ruth decides to go on with Naomi, her mother-in-law. But what you may not have noticed in the story so far, as we read earlier, is that every time Naomi speaks directly to these young ladies, she always refers to them as daughter, even though at this time they are pagan and unbelieving daughters. Every time later that she refers to Ruth and speaks to Ruth directly, she always calls her my daughter. Isn't that beautiful? All this to say that extended family are family too. Moms and dads, or dads rather, the best thing you can ever do for your children is love their mom. And the best thing you can ever do for your married children is love them both. And the best thing you can ever do, or one of the best things you can ever do besides loving your grandchildren, is to love their parents both. I have a son-in-law. He's been here. My oldest daughter, Jennifer, married a man by the name of Owen. And some of you have seen our beautiful three granddaughters. They are the most beautiful little girls in the world. Not that I'm biased. And we own Owen as if he were our own son. We love him. When we see him, we hug him. And I've never told him and called him son because he has a dad of his own. But when we get together, we kibitz, we joke around as all mums and dads do with their daughters and sons-in-law. But I want to tell you that he is my son. Why? Because my daughter chose him, and he's the dad of my grandchildren. And though we have no flesh and blood, running through his veins. He is our family, and that's the way it should be. And so she calls these ladies daughters. In fact, so much so that if the narrator had not explained the situation, that these are daughters-in-law and not daughters, we might read the rest of the story thinking they were her daughters. And so that's why I say extended family is family. But you say, I'm orphaned and I have no family at all. Or I'm single. And some of you who are married may not have had the opportunity, or maybe you can't have children. But you can make family, whether young or old. You can reach out to others. And chances are all of us in our lives have had some beautiful mother or father figure, and we've been touched by their love, or a brother and sister figure in our lives. So why not do the same and make them family? There's an old movie, and I don't expect many of you to have heard it. It's a movie called Goodbye, Mr. Chips. It's an English movie, so I was reminded of it in our tour of England. Mr. Chips is played by the handsome Peter O'Toole, who's made up to look quite dowdy in this film. And the love of his life is played by Petulia Clark, a beautiful singer. Now, this professor in a boys' school, upper-class boys' school in England, private school, he's a kind of a dowdy-looking, prudish, shy schoolmaster. And he's the kind of schoolmaster, by the way, in a school that wears uniforms and caps and gowns. He's the kind of schoolmaster that puts his children to sleep. A professor of ancient history who tries to teach his young boys about the conjugations of Latin and Greek verbs. All the while, his boys are looking out the window, wishing they were outside playing tennis or cricket or rugby. Then something wonderful happens to him. One summer, while he's exploring on summer vacation the ancient ruins of a Greek amphitheater, he meets another English lady. And the two of them couldn't be more different, like chalk and cheese. Because this lady is a star of the stage. She's a singer and dancer in the London music halls. And he's this shy professor. They fall in love. But he can't tell her because he knows that she's just out of his league. Guys, I want to tell you who are married, you married up. And don't forget it. And so he's too shy to propose. Well, she, like Ruth, proposes herself to him. And after a whirlwind marriage and back to this stiff and starchy college, nobody is more surprised than his fellow professors, and especially his class of young boys, when they see this stodgy professor with this beautiful blonde on his arm. Well, it's a lovely story. He changes her and she changes him. No longer, over the years, will he become, is he this shy professor who puts his children to sleep by trying to hammer truths into their head. He becomes a teacher that gives them the joy of learning history and makes them laugh and teaches them truth. And she also changes. Once the floozy and the flirty girl she was, she becomes a devoted wife. At the beginning, nobody thinks this marriage is going to last, but it does last. It does last their whole lifetime. Then comes the Second World War. And during that, so many of his former students, boys, now men, he hears daily about their death in the air or the sea or the land. And he wonders one night as he and his wife are cuddling into each other, her head on his chest, he wonders and he says out loud, "Darling, do you ever have regrets that you married me?" She looks up to him in silence. He says, I mean, do you ever regret that I was never able to give you children? And she looks up and smiles and said, "I have children. You've given me hundreds of children, and all boys." Well, that's what I mean by reaching out to extended family, even to surrogate family. Well, what this professor doesn't know is that he's been such an influence on these young men that they love him and their lives have been enriched because of him. Well, that's what I mean when I say that we're reaching out to others to make them family, as well as our own flesh and blood, our extended family, their family too. And of course, we never really know in this lifetime what beautiful influence we have on those we love. And in the book of Ruth, we discover that. Just that, after pleading with her daughter, you see, I said, Naomi pleads with Orpah and Ruth to go back to their own mothers and family. What happens next is the hinge of the whole story, because Ruth decides not to go back while Orpah does. Now, make no mistake, this was an enormously courageous task. Because if she goes with Ruth, she has no prospect of a husband, no inheritance, no financial provision, no future children, and in a nation where she would know no one except her elderly mother-in-law, and if she died, she too would be left possible starvation. Yet there's one thing. She's heard from her husbands, and perhaps more so from her mother-in-law and perhaps her father-in-law, that there's a God in Israel, a powerful God, a holy God, a loving God, who has protected his children as a shield and delivered them time and time again. And so she makes up her mind to pursue him. And if this is not the moment of her conversion, at least it's a step to it. Look with me at verses 16 and 17, which is the centerpiece of this book, as Ruth, in this most memorable quote, says to Naomi, her mother-in-law, her mom adopted so, she says, "All right, you ready? Wherever you will go, I will go. Wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And wherever you die, I will die. And there I will be buried." Isn't that a beautiful verse? And if we were to know the exact spot, that humble plot of earth, and if we were like archaeologists and to gently excavate that, we would find the remains of two women, their bones mingled together. And if any of you ever intend to be married, there is perhaps no better promise that you can give to each other and add to your wedding vows as you look into her, eyes moistened, and as you look into him and say to one another, "Wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you stay, I will stay. And your family will be my family, and your God," that is Jehovah and Jesus, "will be my God. And when you're buried, I'll be buried there too." Well, the next thing that happens in our story is Naomi's journey home And this is the prodigal daughter's loving return, an overdue return. And for those old enough in Bethlehem to remember her, it's a joyous moment, but not for Naomi. And to all her old acquaintances, when they hail her, saying, "Naomi, Naomi, is it you?" She shakes her head and bows her head as if to reply, "No, it's not me." She says, "I left full, and I have returned empty, because the Lord has been bitter towards me." And she says, "No longer call me Naomi," which means pleasant one, "but call me Mara," which means bitter. Call me who I am. And if Naomi thinks that God has been angry with her, she's wrong. She couldn't be more wrong. As she's about to find out, God is about to open the floodgates of blessing upon her, so that the one once pleasant, now bitter, will become the one greatly blessed. It's a beautiful story. And as for Ruth, why, she's the Cinderella of the Bible. A love story that begins in despair and ends in delight. And through her God-saturated husband, they will bear a son named Obed, and a grandson named Jesse, and a great-grandson named David, the great king. And though they don't know it at the time, if you look in Matthew, you'll see that from this great king, generation after generations, there will come the long-awaited Messiah, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ. What a legacy! A legacy of changed lives. And what if she'd not obeyed the Lord and come back? Well, I want to ask you today, what legacy will you leave to your children, your family, and those around you that you count as family? What inheritance will you give them? And you know that I'm going to say, I'm not talking about money, as much as that kind of legacy is helpful. I'm talking about something much more valuable than money, something that money can never buy. And there's a high price to this, a price in terms of time, for one. What man on his deathbed ever said with regret, I only wish I'd spent more time in the office? Nobody ever said that. It'll cost you the price in terms of time, and a higher price in terms of kindness and gentleness and love and patience, lots of that. And sometimes even forgiveness. What price are you ready to pay? Well, you might not be that president of the company. You may never earn $1 million. You may never have $1 million to give to your children and grandchildren. But you can leave them a legacy of love and acceptance. Wrap your children in the security blanket of love. And long after you're dead and gone, they, for the rest of their lives, will feel the warmth of that life, that love, and their lives will be enriched because of it. Well, you've heard the message from God's Word, and you've heard the gentle whisper of God's Spirit to your heart. What has He been telling you? Has He been telling you to revise and reorder your priorities? God first, family second, job third. Has He been telling you to say words that need to be spoken? Son, I'm proud of you. daughter, I love you. You may even need to say, please forgive me. Forgive me. Whatever you do, be reconciled to those that need to be reconciled with you. And I'm looking out at you, and I know probably there's a dozen, maybe 24 people. I don't know who you are, but you know who you are, that need to be made right with some loved one, a dad, a mom, a daughter, a son-in-law, a daughter-in-law, or a sister or brother or a friend. What will you do about it? Well, I'll leave you with this question, or this image, rather. Writer Jennifer Worth, in a noted trilogy of books about her experience, really her memoirs, as a nurse in East London, the East End, during the 1950s. In the first of her series of memoirs, her trilogy, called Call the Midwife. A series, by the way, that has recently been adapted for television by BBC's Masterpiece Theatre. And that's the only channel I can recommend, other than the History Channel. Don't watch the news much. It's too negative. Once a day, once a week. But in this beautiful series, Call the Midwife, there's one episode that focuses on the relationship between an aging man and his grown daughter. They've become estranged. For 5 years, they haven't talked to one another. Truth is, they're so much alike, they just bang heads. And also, they've both been hurt. He's been so hurt by the loss of his wife and the loss of all his children except this one daughter. And at the death of her mother, she can't take it anymore, and so she leaves. She escapes, not only to escape the pain, but the secret thought that maybe it should have been her that died and not one of her siblings. Well, in the story, this lady becomes pregnant. And in those days, to be pregnant and not have a husband meant that she would lose her job. So she does what she doesn't want to do, but has to do, and she goes home to the pub in which her dad owns, and the upstairs bedroom, and she finds him lying there, dying. Picture the scene, if you can. In the last few hours of his life, as he's slipping away, under the nurse's supervision, she's trying to comfort him when all of a sudden, leaning over the bed, she feels that first stabbing pain. And she knows it's time. And the nurse looking at her, she replies back, "Don't you dare, I'm not leaving him." To which the nurse says, "Well, you want your father to meet his grandchild, don't you?" So here they are, the old man dying in one room, one nurse saying, "Hold on, Mr. Masterson. Hold on, Mr. Masterson. Your daughter's in labor. If you hear me, hold on." And in the very next room, with another nurse, she's giving birth. As soon as she gives birth, she doesn't take the child to herself, but she says, "Take him to Dad." And the nurse says, "Mr. Masterson, you have a grandson. And I think he's rather perfect." And given a bit of new strength because of this, he awakes out of his semi-unconsciousness and he says, "Can I hold him?" And tenderly, while he's lying on his back, they put the baby in his arms. And he says these words, speaking to the baby, "I'm just leaving, I'm afraid, and you just arrived. We're passing, you and I, and I'm very pleased to meet you. Now look after your mom. That's your job now. and he slips away. The scene ends with the words of the narrator saying, "The world is full of love that goes unspoken. It doesn't mean that it's felt less deeply." And what I want to say to you today is, friends, love your family. Love all your family, extended and adopted. Love them deeply and let them know it. Thanks be to God.